January 1945. The Ardennes lay frozen under a silence that seemed almost sacred, a silence born not of peace but exhaustion. In the skeletal remains of a Belgian farmhouse near Bastogne, canvas tents flapped weakly in the winter wind. Inside, the air reeked of iodine, ether, and burnt diesel. Every cot held a man half alive. American and German uniforms blurred beneath layers of bandages and mud. A young American nurse, her hands trembling from cold and fatigue, leaned over a wounded German soldier. His chest was wrapped tight, his breath shallow, his eyes full of disbelief. She held a cup of water to his lips. He hesitated, then drank. For the first time since being captured, he saw no hatred, only kindness. Tears rolled down his cheeks, cutting clean lines through the grime. Around him, the low hum of whispered prayers and muffled cries filled the night. The nurse pressed a hand to his shoulder, whispering softly, "You'll be all right." Outside, artillery still echoed in the hills. But in that small room, for a fleeting moment, mercy triumphed over war. To understand how such compassion survived the winter of mankind's darkest war, we must go back to where it began. By the final months of 1944, the Allied advance into Western Europe had slowed to a grinding crawl. The euphoria of D-Day was gone, replaced by the bitter cold of an unforgiving winter. The roads of Belgium and Luxembourg had turned into frozen veins of mud and ice, choking the supply lines and testing the endurance of every soldier who walked them. The German army, cornered but not yet broken, launched a desperate counterattack through the Ardennes, an operation Adolf Hitler named Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. It became known to the world as the Battle of the Bulge. For 6 weeks, from December 16, 1944, until late January 1945, the forests of the Ardennes became a graveyard of steel. Tanks burned through the snow. Villages changed hands by the hour. Thousands were wounded or lost in the blizzards that swallowed whole battalions. Behind the front lines, another army fought a different kind of battle, the medical personnel of the Allied forces. Among them were the women of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, whose courage often went unrecorded amid the noise of guns. By 1944, more than 57,000 American nurses were serving around the world, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific. They worked in field hospitals, evacuation tents, and surgical trucks that moved with the infantry, often within range of enemy fire. When the German counterattack struck, these nurses found themselves suddenly surrounded by chaos. Field hospitals were flooded with casualties, Americans, Belgians, and captured Germans alike. The distinction between friend and enemy vanished beneath the bandages. What mattered was blood loss, pulse, and the faint hope of survival. Inside the canvas walls of a mobile army surgical hospital, temperatures dropped below freezing. Nurses worked in gloves stiff with frost, their breath visible as they leaned over operating tables. Lights flickered as generators coughed in the cold. The sound of scalpels clinking against metal trays mixed with the distant rumble of artillery. Despite exhaustion, the discipline was absolute. They operated under the Geneva Convention, which required that all wounded be treated equally, regardless of uniform. Yet the human test of that principle came not from rules but from the faces of those they helped, some of whom, only hours earlier, had aimed rifles at their comrades. In letters home, nurses described the surreal coexistence of compassion and carnage. "We hardly sleep," wrote Lieutenant Mary Barlow from the 16th Field Hospital near Liège. "Some of the German boys cry when we dress their wounds. They don't believe we would help them. One kissed my hand today. I didn't know what to say." Such moments were never publicized in wartime newsreels. They didn't fit the image of victory or vengeance. But they formed the quiet backbone of humanity amid destruction. Every sunrise brought new convoys of stretchers, the moans of the wounded echoing down muddy corridors. Supplies were scarce. Blood plasma ran low. Nurses improvised with what they had: morphine diluted, bandages washed and reused. They stitched torn flesh by lantern light and prayed that the next shell wouldn't find their tent. By early January 1945, as the German offensive faltered, hundreds of wounded prisoners began pouring into Allied medical lines. Many were teenage members of the Volksgrenadier divisions or Hitler Youth units thrown into battle. Their faces, pale and terrified, told of a nation collapsing from within. In the cold heart of that winter, compassion became a quiet rebellion, a refusal to surrender to hatred, and yet, as the tides of war shifted, new questions arose about duty. mercy, and the fragile boundary between enemy and patient. It was in this moral twilight that the next chapter unfolded. As the winter deepened, the line between survival and surrender blurred. In the snow-choked villages of Belgium, the Army's medical network expanded at a desperate pace. Field hospitals, aid stations, and evacuation units stretched far beyond their intended limits. By mid-January 1945, some hospitals were treating more than 500 wounded soldiers a day, nearly double their capacity. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had promised humane treatment for all wounded combatants, including prisoners of war. But in practice, war rarely allowed such decency. In the Ardennes, the difference came down to the individual, to the humanity of those holding the scalpel or the syringe. American nurses and doctors were trained to treat injuries, not identities. Yet as captured German soldiers were brought in men wearing the same insignia that had massacred civilians or shelled Allied convoys, every decision became a test of conscience. In one field report from the 44th Evacuation Hospital, near Malmedy, an Army doctor noted, "Our nurses worked on German wounded until their hands bled. They never asked names, only where it hurt." Nearby, the 2nd Field Hospital was caring for 72 German prisoners alongside 210 Americans. The wounded were laid out side by side, separated only by blankets and luck. What shocked many of the German soldiers was not the medical efficiency, it was the kindness. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal invaders, merciless conquerors. Yet when these soldiers opened their eyes in Allied hospitals, they saw something entirely different. Women who spoke softly, who cleaned their wounds, who even wrote letters home for them. One German paratrooper, barely 19, later told a Red Cross interviewer, "When she smiled at me, I cried. I could not understand it. Why would an enemy care if I lived?" This emotional dissonance spread through the German POW wards. Many of the men wept openly, some from pain, others from the collapse of everything they'd been taught to believe. For the American nurses, it was equally disorienting. Compassion came naturally, but guilt often followed. They wondered if comforting the enemy betrayed the memory of friends who had died only days earlier. Conditions in the hospitals remained brutal. Frostbite, gangrene, and infection were constant threats. Blood transfusion equipment froze in the cold. Nurses stood for 18-hour shifts in boots soaked through with melted snow. Yet despite the suffering, morale held not through orders, but through a quiet moral conviction that saving life, any life, still mattered. The Red Cross and Military Medical Command reinforced this ideal. Circulars reminded personnel that a wounded man ceases to be an enemy once he cannot fight. The message resonated with many of the nurses, who saw firsthand that humanity did not vanish beneath a uniform. Still, there were moments of conflict. Some American soldiers, hardened by months of combat, resented the care given to German prisoners. "Why waste morphine on them?" one infantryman muttered in a nurse's diary. She wrote back simply, "Because I'm a nurse, not a judge." Such words carried weight far beyond the battlefield. In a war defined by industrialized death, every act of mercy felt like a small defiance, proof that compassion could survive even in a world consumed by hatred. By February 1945, as Allied forces pushed east toward the Rhine, field hospitals followed closely behind. The wounded Germans continued to arrive, some grateful, others silent, all broken. Letters from that period describe the same haunting pattern: disbelief, gratitude, and tears. The nurses' duty was never political. It was human. They bound wounds that transcended nations and reminded even their enemies that empathy could still exist. But beneath this fragile peace, war had not yet finished with them. For soon the mercy of those nurses would be tested in ways no rulebook had prepared them for. Every war has its front lines, the places where men fight, bleed, and fall. But for the nurses of World War II, their battlefield was quieter, closer, and far more personal. It was the space between life and death, fought not with rifles but with steady hands and steady hearts. In the frozen field hospitals of Belgium and Luxembourg, courage did not come in bursts of heroism. It came in the unending rhythm of duty, the next wound, the next stretcher, the next whispered word of comfort. Many of these women were in their early 20s, far from home, facing horrors no training could prepare them for. They worked through bombardments that shook their tents and through nights where the temperature dropped below freezing. When the front lines shifted, they moved with them, loading operating tables into trucks, performing surgeries in barns and basements, and when wounded Germans were brought in, often by American medics dragging them through the snow, the nurses did what they had sworn to do. They healed without hatred. One nurse later wrote, "I stopped seeing uniforms after the first night. They all cried the same. Their faces were calm, but their souls bore scars. They were the quiet sentinels of humanity in a time when the world seemed to forget what that word meant. Each act of care, a bandaged arm, a drop of morphine, a kind glance was a small rebellion against the cruelty surrounding them. The nurses of the Bulge did not fight for glory. They fought for decency, and that battle in many ways was harder to win. For the German soldiers, the moment of capture often felt like the end of everything, the collapse of honor, nation, and survival. Many had been told that capture by the Americans meant certain death or torture. Their propaganda films showed Allied forces as monsters, soulless invaders who would show no mercy. Yet, when they were carried into American field hospitals, the first faces they saw were not of vengeance, but compassion. Nurses spoke gently, using broken German or gestures. They cleaned wounds that had gone untreated for days. They offered food, cigarettes, even comfort. The shock of this kindness often struck harder than the pain of their injuries. In letters later recorded by the International Red Cross, captured German soldiers described the experience with disbelief. One young officer from the 2nd Panzer Division wrote, "The nurse held my hand as they took the bullet from my side. She was the enemy, and yet she wept when I screamed. I cried too. I didn't understand the world anymore." For many, it was their first moment of genuine moral collapse, not from defeat on the battlefield, but from being shown humanity by those they had been taught to hate. Some prayed aloud, asking forgiveness. Others simply wept. These tears, recorded again and again in witness accounts, were not just for their wounds. They were for a war that had turned them into something less than human, and for the realization that even among their enemies, humanity still lived. World War II was not only a struggle of armies, it was a moral reckoning. Entire cities were erased, millions murdered, and compassion seemed to vanish under the weight of ideology. But within that storm, small acts of mercy became monumental. When an American nurse dressed the wounds of a German soldier, it wasn't simply medical protocol, it was an assertion of principle. It said, even here, even now, there are limits to hatred. The moral dilemma was constant. How could one tend to a man whose uniform symbolized oppression? How could one care for those who might have killed American boys days earlier? The answer lay not in politics, but in humanity itself. If we stop caring, one nurse wrote in her diary, then we become no different than the war. That belief that mercy was not weakness, but strength became the invisible code of the Army Nurse Corps. It separated civilization from savagery. Even when civilization itself was collapsing, the Red Cross supervisors who visited the front later testified that the nurses' treatment of German prisoners was among the most honorable displays of moral integrity witnessed during the campaign. It wasn't just medical care, it was moral defiance, a refusal to let hatred define the human spirit, and so, as the war raged outside their tents, a quieter war was being won inside them, a war for compassion itself. The humanity, shock, and morality of these encounters revealed the first layers of this extraordinary story. But beyond emotion lay other forces shaping these moments. The policies that allowed it, the technology that made it possible, and the leadership that insisted on preserving decency even in the darkest hours. In the great machinery of war, compassion rarely begins at the top. Yet during the closing months of World War II, certain Allied commanders understood that how their armies treated the defeated would shape the peace to come. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, had issued strict orders that captured German soldiers were to receive humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Eisenhower, who had seen the ruins of French towns and the piles of civilian corpses left by the Wehrmacht, believed mercy was not weakness. It was the first step toward reconstruction. "The world will judge us," he once said, "by how we act when we hold power." In field hospitals across the Western Front, those words echoed through the actions of ordinary medical personnel. Doctors and nurses carried no weapons, but they embodied Eisenhower's principle through their work. Medical units like the 77th Evacuation Hospital and 12th Field Hospital were given explicit orders. All wounded Allied or Axis were to be stabilized and treated equally. Colonel Charles E. Beasley, chief medical officer attached to the First Army, reinforced this policy in a directive sent in late 1944. In the eyes of medicine, the wounded are no longer combatants. They are patients. These orders were more than bureaucratic formality. They shielded medical staff from reprisal and moral confusion, providing clarity in a war without it. Under such policies, field nurses could perform their duties without fear of accusation or judgment, focusing only on the patient in front of them. Yet leadership was not limited to generals and colonels. Within each hospital tent, it was the senior nurses women like Captain Mary Reeder and Lieutenant Ruth Haskell who maintained discipline, calm, and morale. They rotated teams, ensured sterilization even under shell fire, and sometimes intervened when emotions threatened to boil over. They understood that every act of mercy would be remembered not by history books, but by the men who lived because of it. The compassion shown in those makeshift hospitals was supported by another quiet revolution, the rapid advancement of battlefield medicine. By 1945, American field hospitals were among the most mobile and sophisticated medical units in military history. Innovations like blood plasma transfusions, portable X-ray machines, and penicillin, still a relatively new drug, saved tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Penicillin, in particular, became the miracle of the battlefield. Initially scarce, it was distributed first to Allied soldiers. But as supply chains stabilized, surplus doses were often used on captured German wounded, a gesture that surprised even the doctors themselves. "We had enough to spare," one surgeon recalled. And a dying man is a dying man, no matter what uniform he wears. Evacuation systems had also evolved dramatically. Within hours of injury, a soldier could be transported from the front line to a surgical tent, then to an evacuation hospital miles behind. The Army Nurse Corps played a vital role in these chains, often riding with the wounded in freezing open trucks or small aircraft, keeping them alive through cold and shock. The tools of modern medicine became the instruments of empathy. Every transfusion shared between American and German blood symbolized something larger, the invisible thread of shared humanity running through both. Technology allowed compassion to transcend nationality. And in doing so, it quietly dismantled the walls built by propaganda and hate. War changes everyone. It touches not only those who fight, but also those who heal. For the nurses of the Bulge, the act of saving enemy lives left deep psychological marks, both painful and profound. Many spoke later of the haunting contradiction, tending to men who might have killed their friends or families, and yet feeling sorrow for them. The weight of this empathy could not be easily set down. After the war, studies conducted by the U.S. Veterans Administration revealed that a significant number of Army nurses suffered symptoms we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, insomnia, nightmares, emotional detachment. Some were haunted by the faces of the enemy soldiers they had saved, wondering what became of them after the war ended. But for others, those memories became sources of strength. In interviews decades later, former nurse Lieutenant Frances Slanger, one of the first nurses to land in Normandy, described compassion as a form of survival. "When you help someone live," she said, "you remind yourself that you're still human." This quiet philosophy shaped post-war reconciliation in ways few realized at the time. The stories of nurses who had treated Germans were retold in Allied newspapers after the surrender, often as symbols of moral victory. They showed that even in total war, mercy had not vanished. In Germany, too, these stories spread among returning prisoners. Some later wrote letters of thanks to the U.S. Army or the Red Cross, describing those moments of unexpected kindness as their first glimpse of a different world, one built not on hate, but on forgiveness. The psychological ripple of those tears shed in a frozen tent somewhere in Belgium reached far beyond that battlefield. It touched families, governments, and generations that followed. For both healer and healed, mercy had left a scar, but it was the kind of scar that healed rather than wounded. As the snows began to melt and the thunder of artillery faded, the war itself neared its final turning point. But in one small field hospital on the edge of Bastogne, the most unforgettable moment was still to come. A night when compassion and death stood side by side, and the enemy wept in the arms of those they once vowed to destroy. January 12, 1945. The snow fell thick over Bastogne, heavy, relentless, muffling the thunder of artillery in a cold white silence. The German counteroffensive was dying, but it refused to die quietly. Mortar shells still landed in the valleys. The forests were full of smoke and splintered trees, and in the shadow of that destruction stood the 44th Evacuation Hospital, a cluster of tents and trucks barely holding together under the weight of the wounded. Inside, the air was a fog of sweat, ether, and diesel fumes. Every cot was occupied. Men groaned, whispered, and shivered beneath thin wool blankets. Outside, trucks roared through the snow, bringing in the next wave of American infantrymen from the 101st Airborne, and captured Germans pulled from the same shattered ridgelines. The front had collapsed inward, and now friend and foe arrived together in the same convoys. The nurses had been awake for 36 hours straight. Their hands were cracked from washing, their faces pale beneath dim lantern light. They no longer flinched at the sight of open wounds. They moved on instinct, dress, clamp, transfuse, move on. The war had stripped them of everything but endurance. That afternoon, a group of medics dragged in a half-dozen German prisoners. Their gray uniforms were frozen stiff, their boots caked with blood and snow. One of them, a young corporal no older than 19, clutched his stomach, moaning softly. A bullet had passed through his abdomen. He was dying, but protocol demanded he be treated. Nurse Helen Morrow from Minnesota took him first. She spoke no German and he spoke no English, but language wasn't needed. She saw fear in his eyes, the same terror she had seen in hundreds of others. She cut away his tunic, cleaned the wound, and called for plasma. The corporal's breathing slowed. He reached for her wrist weakly as if to ask why. Helen paused. The war outside was merciless, but here, inside the tent, she could choose. She squeezed his hand and whispered softly, "You're safe now." He stared at her, confused. Then, slowly, tears began to spill down his cheeks. The doctor arrived and performed an emergency laparotomy on the rough table. The boy's pulse faded, then steadied. The room was silent except for the hiss of the heater and the rattle of surgical instruments. When it was over, the doctor shook his head. Too much blood was lost. Helen stayed beside him until his breathing stopped. She closed his eyes, placed a folded cloth over his chest, and stood motionless for a long time. In the next cot lay an American paratrooper from the same skirmish. Both had fallen within 100 yards of each other. Helen moved to him next, continuing her work without pause. There was no time to mourn. There was never time. That night, the hospital ran out of morphine. Nurses tore strips of their own clothing for bandages. The generator coughed and went dark, plunging the tent into candlelight. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the open flaps, settling on the faces of the unconscious. Another German prisoner, older, maybe in his 40s, was brought in with a shattered leg. As the nurse cleaned the wound, he began to mutter in broken English, "Why do you help us?" "We kill your men," the nurse, her voice barely audible, answered simply, "Because it's right." He turned his face away and began to sob. One American orderly wrote later in his diary, "I never thought I'd see a German cry." But that night the tent was full of them. They wept when the nurses spoke to them kindly. Some prayed. Some tried to kiss their hands. They didn't understand mercy, not after the things they'd seen. As dawn broke, the snow outside turned red and brown with melted blood. The field hospital was silent except for the distant boom of retreating artillery. The German offensive was finished. The Battle of the Bulge had been won. But inside that makeshift tent, no one felt victorious. The nurses moved slowly through the rows of cots, checking pulses, changing dressings, whispering to those still awake. Exhaustion had hollowed them out, yet something fragile and enduring remained, a quiet conviction that what they had done mattered. In that frozen corner of Europe, where men had come to destroy each other, compassion had survived. And yet that night was only the beginning. For the next wave of wounded would bring the most powerful and heartbreaking scene of all, when the full meaning of mercy would reveal itself, not in words but in tears. The next evening, January 13th, 1945, snow had stopped falling, but the wind still howled through the Ardennes. Inside the 44th Evacuation Hospital, the air was heavy with exhaustion. Lanterns cast long, trembling shadows on the tent walls. The nurses, too tired to speak, moved through the aisles like ghosts. tending to the endless line of stretchers that kept arriving from the front. Just before midnight, another convoy appeared, 3 jeeps and an ambulance marked with faded red crosses. In the back were 6 more wounded, 3 Americans and 3 Germans. One of the Germans, a sergeant from the Volksgrenadier Division, had been found clutching a photograph of his wife and child when they pulled him from a crater. The picture was torn and soaked with blood. Nurse Ruth Haskell took him in. His left arm was nearly gone, the stump crudely wrapped in cloth. He was barely conscious. The surgeon ordered immediate amputation above the shoulder. As they worked, Ruth noticed his eyes flutter open. The man mumbled in German incoherently, panicked. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the fear. She bent close and whispered softly, "It's all right. You're not alone." For a moment, he stared at her confused, then reached weakly toward his pocket. She pulled out a photograph of a woman and a child standing before a small house. Ruth held it up so he could see. He looked at it, then at her, and began to cry. Silent, shaking sobs that broke through the mechanical rhythm of surgery. Even the doctor paused. The tent fell quiet except for the wind. When the operation ended, the sergeant was still barely alive. Ruth stayed with him as they cleaned the instruments. He kept whispering "Danke, danke" over and over, until his voice faded into sleep. In another corner of the ward, an American medic was fixing a German's broken leg. Across the aisle, a captured SS officer, his face pale and bloodless, watched in silence. His expression was unreadable pride, confusion, perhaps shame. Then slowly he covered his face with his one good hand and began to weep. The sound of those tears, soft, reluctant, human, spread through the tent like an echo. Some cried quietly, others turned their faces away. Even the nurses, hardened by months of suffering, felt the weight of it. An army chaplain who witnessed the scene later wrote in his journal, "There was a strange holiness in that tent. The enemy was no longer the enemy. They were just tired, broken, terrified men, and the women who cared for them became something greater than soldiers. They became the last light in a world gone dark." By dawn, word of the scene had spread through the hospital. Medics spoke of the night the Germans cried. It wasn't mockery, it was disbelief. These were men raised under a regime that worshipped hardness, trained never to show emotion. Yet here, at the hands of their former enemies, they had broken down not from pain, but from grace. The following morning, an American colonel touring the hospital stopped to thank the staff. He praised their endurance, their precision, their courage, but he said little of their kindness. That part would never appear in official reports. Compassion did not win battles. It healed what was left behind them. Before leaving, the colonel turned to one nurse and asked, "How do you do it? How do you keep helping them after everything?" She hesitated, then answered quietly, "Because someone has to remember we're still human." Outside, the horizon was turning gray with the first light of day. The snow glistened under the faint sun, scattered with footprints and the dark stains of blood. Trucks started their engines, preparing to move the wounded deeper behind the lines. The war was moving east now toward the Rhine, toward Germany itself, but the nurses would carry that night with them. For in those few hours, amid the sound of wind and whispered gratitude, they had glimpsed something that even victory could not give, the rediscovery of humanity itself. It was the night when compassion broke through the armor of war, and when hardened men, raised in hatred, learned to cry again. And when the guns finally fell silent weeks later, the memory of that night lingered, a fragile truth that would follow them home, haunting and healing all at once. The guns of the Ardennes had gone quiet. The fields that once burned were now blanketed in silence and snow. But the aftermath of what those nurses had done and what their kindness had awakened was only beginning to unfold. By February 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had ended. The German offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, had collapsed under the weight of Allied resistance and dwindling fuel. Tens of thousands lay dead across the frozen Ardennes. Thousands more, both American and German, filled the field hospitals and evacuation centers stretching from Bastogne to Liège. In those hospitals, the war's brutality had taken on a quieter form. The nurses of the U.S. Army Medical Corps worked day and night to keep men alive, even as victory seemed inevitable. But among them, the memory of that night when German prisoners had wept under the care of American women lingered like a ghost. The event was not reported in newspapers. No military communique mentioned it, yet word spread among the troops, carried by letters home and whispers in the trenches. Soldiers who had seen their friends die at the hands of the Wehrmacht began to speak differently about the enemy. Not kindly, perhaps, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the line between good and evil, between soldier and human, had blurred in those final months. For the nurses, that realization was heavier than any medal. Lieutenant Ruth Haskell, who had held the hand of the wounded German sergeant, later wrote in her diary, "They looked at us like they had never been touched without hate. Some were too weak to speak, but their eyes said everything. I think they cried not because of pain, but because for the first time, someone saw them as men again." In the weeks that followed, many of those German patients were transferred to prisoner of war camps in France and England. Some wrote letters not to the military but to the nurses, short, hesitant notes written in broken English or careful German script. They were letters of thanks. Some even enclosed photos, a family, a village, a child smiling at the camera. One letter, preserved today in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps archives, reads, "You bandaged my arm when I thought no one would care if I lived. You said, 'You'll be all right.' I believed you. I will tell my son that an American woman saved his father." Such words carried no military value, no strategic meaning, but in the shattered heart of Europe, they were the first fragile steps towards something that seemed almost impossible: reconciliation. Historians often describe 1945 as a time of ruin and revenge. Cities burned. Concentration camps were liberated, revealing horrors that defied imagination. Hatred, once unleashed, was slow to die. Yet within that inferno, the work of nurses, American, British, Soviet, and German alike, stood as quiet defiance against the dehumanization of total war. The Red Cross documented over 1.3 million Allied medical personnel who served in some capacity during the war. Thousands of them were women. Many never saw combat, yet their courage rivaled that of any soldier. They fought against time, infection, and despair. Their weapons were morphine, water, and mercy. And in the ruins of the Reich, those who survived carried with them the invisible scars of what they had witnessed, not just death, but humanity reborn through suffering. The story of the American nurses who left German soldiers in tears became a symbol within the nursing corps. It reminded them that even in the darkest moments, their mission was not vengeance but preservation of the human spirit. For a generation raised amid total war, that was a revelation more powerful than any victory parade. As Germany crumbled and the Allies advanced toward the Rhine, the nurses faced a new question. What would become of the men they had saved? And of the compassion that had defied the hatred of war? By the spring of 1945, the front lines were dissolving into chaos. Allied armies were advancing into Germany, uncovering the devastation left by years of Nazi rule. Cities lay in ashes, bridges destroyed, and millions displaced. Amid that collapse, field hospitals moved with the troops through shattered villages, across makeshift bridges into the heart of a dying Reich. For the nurses who had served in the Ardennes, the journey east was both triumph and torment. Every step toward victory meant another encounter with the human wreckage of war. In March, as the U.S. Third Army crossed the Rhine near Remagen, several of the nurses from the 44th Evacuation Hospital were reassigned to treat prisoners streaming in from collapsing German divisions. These were not the fanatical soldiers of the early war years. They were young conscripts, frostbitten, terrified, and often grateful simply to be captured. One nurse later recalled, "They were boys, really, 19, 20 years old. We gave them soup, changed their bandages, and they looked at us as if we were from another world." By then, the story of the German soldiers weeping in the Ardennes had taken on a quiet legend among the medical staff. It became something of a whispered parable, proof that mercy could survive the war, but not everyone saw it that way. Some American soldiers, hardened by the loss of comrades, resented the compassion shown to their enemies. In the barracks and mess halls, arguments broke out. A few called it betrayal, others called it decency, yet the nurses did not waver. Their duty was not to choose sides, but to preserve life where life still flickered. When victory finally came in May 1945, the celebrations that erupted across Europe felt distant to them. They were too tired, too haunted. They had seen too much. In the final weeks before the war's end, the 44th Evacuation Hospital cared for both liberated concentration camp victims and wounded German soldiers, often in the same tent. The moral tension of that reality was unbearable. Yet it was in those moments that the meaning of their service became clearest. Lieutenant Ruth Haskell wrote in one of her last wartime letters, "There are men here who fought for a cause that destroyed the world, and men who suffered because of it. I tend to both because if I forget that they are all human, then the war has won something far worse than territory." That line, "then the war has won something far worse than territory," would later appear in a post-war Red Cross bulletin, cited as an example of the moral endurance of the American nurse. After the war, many of these women returned home quietly. They packed away their uniforms and medals, married, raised children, and rarely spoke of what they had witnessed. Their names faded from history books, but their work and their moment of compassion in that frozen field hospital rippled through generations of military medicine. In post-war Germany, captured soldiers who had survived that night in 1945 carried the memory too. Some told their families. Some visited America decades later to thank the nurses or their descendants who had shown them mercy when no one else did. One German veteran, interviewed in 1988, said with trembling voice, "When I was wounded, I believed I would die alone. But an American woman held my hand. I wept like a child. She said nothing, only smiled. I never forgot her. I named my daughter Ruth." Moments like that never made it into the official chronicles of the war. Yet they speak louder than most victories because they remind us that even in the face of destruction, compassion can outlast hate. The war had ended. The guns had fallen silent. But in the quiet aftermath, what endured were not the battle cries. It was the soft voices of the nurses who refused to surrender their humanity. Their story, whispered in hospital tents and remembered in faded letters, now stands as one of the rare moments when mercy became an act of defiance and kindness, the most powerful weapon of all. History often remembers war in the language of power divisions, offensives, casualties, victories. But hidden beneath those cold statistics are moments that defy the logic of conflict. Moments when ordinary people standing amid ruin chose compassion over cruelty. The story of the American nurses who left German soldiers in tears is one of those rare moments. It did not change the outcome of World War II. It did not win a medal or a mention in the papers. Yet, in its quiet humanity, it revealed the deeper truth of the war, that even in the worst darkness, light can survive through mercy. These women were not saints or heroes in their own eyes. They were tired, underfed, often frightened. They carried the same fatigue and trauma as the men they treated. But where others saw enemies, they saw patience. Where others saw guilt, they saw pain. And that difference, simple, human, defiant, became an act of resistance against the very hatred that fueled the war. When the world rebuilt itself after 1945, it was not just bridges and cities that needed reconstruction. It was the idea of humanity itself. The nurses of the Ardennes, without knowing it, helped begin that process. Their kindness proved that the human heart could remain unbroken, even when the world around it had shattered. Decades later, as historians sifted through the records of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, many of their names were found only in rosters and transport lists, but among those fading documents were letters, fragile pieces of paper carrying gratitude across languages and borders, letters that spoke not of nations but of people. One line written by a German survivor captures the meaning best. "You did not see an enemy. You saw a man. That is why I am alive." War at its core strips humanity away. But these women in their white aprons stained with blood and snow gave a piece of it back. And in that simple act of mercy, on a freezing night in 1945, they reminded the world of something that armies and empires too easily forget: that kindness can conquer what hatred never will.